Welcome. I am honored to welcome you to our virtual Dean's Lecture in the College of Arts and Science at New York University this evening. Thanks for coming. Hi, my name is Gene Jarrett, Dean of the College of Arts and Science. Here in CAS, we are committed to providing a unique educational experience for our students. This experience seeks not only to incorporate excellent classroom and virtual ways of teaching and learning, but also to offer unique and exciting co-curricular lectures and events that spotlight our faculty and focus on topics that deeply affect our broader community. With the backdrop of the pandemic keeping us mostly apart, finding opportunities to connect with one another with these goals and ideals in mind is important now more than ever before. In 1956, the Bentson family established the Bentson Foundation to support a diverse array of charitable causes in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota. Throughout their lives, Larry and Nancy Bentson were known for their compassion, quiet generosity, and strong commitment to their faith. Larry and Nancy created a lasting legacy of philanthropy that continues to this day through the work of the Bentson Foundation. Areas of giving have included higher education, public health, and arts and humanities. Although the Bentson Foundation's primary geographic focus has been the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, the wonderful CAS experience enjoyed by Bentson granddaughter Kimberly Bentson Kauth, who was CAS class of 2009 with a degree in philosophy, inspired the Bentson Foundation to endow and augur the CAS Bentson Scholars Lecture Series in July 2013, with the hope of fostering undergraduate research and intellectual exchange in their areas of academic interest, as well as in areas with which they may never have been previously familiar. Bentson lectures are delivered by current full-time faculty who teach in the College of Arts and Science. Our Bentson speakers and their topics are nothing less than compelling and diverse. Recent Bentson lecturers include Professor of Anthropology Rainer Rapp, who spoke on prenatal genetic testing and reproductive technology. We have listened to Professor of Psychology Karen Adolph, who analyzed how learning to move are constrained and facilitated by infants' growing bodies, the features of their ever-expanding environments, and their caregivers' child-rearing processes. We have heard from Professor of Creative Writing and Pulitzer Prize winner Jeffrey Eugenides, who presented a memoir in progress, Pink Belly. We have enjoyed Professor of Neuroscience Wendy Suzuki, who discussed her research of how the brain can evolve in its relation to its environment. And we have been moved by Professor of History Jennifer Morgan, who described how race, gender, and the past inform our present and the future. I am now delighted to introduce today's Bentson lecturer, Kwame Anthony Appiah. He is Professor of Philosophy and Law at NYU. He has taught at the University of Ghana, Cambridge University in England, Yale University, Duke University, and Harvard University, as well as Princeton University. He grew up in Ghana and received undergraduate and doctoral degrees in philosophy from Cambridge, where he was an undergraduate, a graduate student, and a research fellow at Clare College. Professor Appiah's work has been in the philosophy of mind and language, ethics, political philosophy, and the philosophy of art, of culture, and of the social sciences, especially anthropology. In the realm of literary studies, he has focused on African and African-American literature. He served as president of the Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association in 2007, chair of the APA board from 2008 to 2011, and president of the Modern Language Association in 2016. He also sat on the boards of the American Council of Learned Societies, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, New York Public Library and Public Theater, and the PEN American Center. In 2012, President Barack Obama presented Professor Appiah with the National Humanities Medal. He has been recipient of upward of 20 honorary degrees from fellow institutions as distinguished as Duke, University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University, and Harvard. Professor Appiah's publications include Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers, Lines of Descent, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Emergence of Identity, As If, Idealization and Ideals, and The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity, along with 3 novels. Professor Appiah writes the weekly ethicist column for the New York Times Sunday magazine. More personally, let me say that in one-on-one conversation, Professor Appiah strikes me as the epitome of the life of the mind. He exemplifies the intellectual contemplation to which we should all aspire as we seek to solve the most pressing and complex problems of our times. He is a person of great warmth who has an abiding interest in the well-being and education of our students, and who exemplifies the very best of what a faculty member could contribute to the advancement of knowledge, whether among our own very students, among the specialists of an academic discipline, or before a public audience like this one, which can look forward to accessible language to distill profound academic ideas. After Professor Appiah's lecture, we will have a question and answer session, but feel free at any time during this lecture to submit your question to the Q&A section of your window. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kwame Anthony Appiah. Professor Appiah, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Jarrett, and I'm delighted and honored to have been asked to talk to you today. And I have picked as my topic the ethics of work, and we'll see as we go why, and I hope you'll find it interesting, and I hope to be able to have some interesting discussions at the end. But I have to begin by recording a debt, which is that I spent the academic year 2018-19 thinking about the issues I want to discuss today with 3 postdoctoral fellows at NYU in the Global Institute for Advanced Study, funded by the McGruin Foundation. And they were a philosopher, Denise Celentano, a sociologist, David Frayne, and an economist, Ricardo Zago. So everything I say is informed by their work and these conversations, and I want to begin by acknowledging my enormous indebtedness to these 3 young scholars in different fields. Okay, so here we go. Most healthy adults today spend 5 days of the week for much of their lives doing what we call a job. The US Bureau of Labor Statistics declares that all workers are classified into one of 867 detailed occupations according to their occupational definition. I find myself, like some of you today, at 25-1126, philosophy and religion teachers post-secondary. Because people typically spend 8 hours or more of each week at work and another 8 or so hours sleeping, it's where we spend about 1/3 of our waking hours. At work is ambiguous between, as we're very well aware at the moment in the context of the pandemic, between working and in the workplace. But even in normal times, many of us are sometimes at work at home as well. So work is also the center of a great number of our relationships. And if we're lucky, our job is not just a source of decent income, we will think what we are doing worthwhile. So we'll also hope to be esteemed if we do well at work, if our work is a source of serious achievement in a field, and we can take pride in what we do, and so it may be a source, therefore, of self-esteem as well. And finally, work can be a source of identity. Perhaps it gives you a profession, conferring on you the status of an auto mechanic, a beautician, a journalist, a nurse, a lawyer, a teacher. And often, along with education and connections, it helps fix your social class. Having started working in our late teens or early 20s, we're likely to continue working for another half century or more. And in retirement, when we're no longer doing paid work, or at any rate doing much less of it, we may suffer the loss of the sense of purpose that an occupation once gave us and feel nostalgia for the daily rhythms of our job. Given this centrality of work in our lives, it's odd, I think, how little space it takes up in contemporary ethics and liberal political philosophy. This silence about work echoes a long silence about the family, which feminist theorizing has done something to remediate. And it's certainly going to be important to keep track of gender and family in thinking about work as well. We do, of course, regularly discuss some of the products of work, income and wealth, and more recently, esteem and respect. We think about the allocation of these in political philosophy when we discuss what we call distributive justice, or when we discuss equality. We recognize in ethics and moral philosophy generally that the character of our relationships matters, And this thought has come to be central to some recent thinking about political equality too, because the character of our relationships with each other as citizens can matter. But the focus of our interest is more likely to be on relations, as I said, with our fellow citizens generally, on what it means to treat each other as equals, for example, in public life, than on how we interact with others in the workplace in particular. Indeed, we take it for granted that at work, we are not equals. Most work is organized hierarchically. There are managers, bosses, deans, presidents. We spent a great deal of time in political philosophy reflecting on how the state and its agents can derive the authority to command the citizen. Only recently, I think it's fair to say, have philosophers begun to take with full seriousness questions about democracy in the workplace. Now, there are exceptions to the relative silence about work as a philosophical problem. Elizabeth Anderson's book, Private Government, How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It, is an eminent, exemplary, and excellent recent example here. And Axel Honneth has connected work with important issues of what philosophers call recognition in The Struggle for Recognition, The Moral Grammar of Social Conflicts, and in some of his writings since. He's, of course, following in the footsteps of Marx and the Marxists, who thought a great deal about work in ways shaped by their debt to Hegel. In the 1950s, Hannah Arendt, writing in her book, The Human Condition, distinguished labor, making or acquiring food and shelter and all the other things we need to sustain our biological life, from work, which is the artificial shaping of the world to make products. She had a final category, action, which involved things we do with one another. And her book, which first appeared in 1958, already addresses the significance of automation. We are, she wrote, a society of laborers which is about to be liberated from the fetters of labor. And this society doesn't any longer know of those other higher and more meaningful activities for the sake of which this freedom would deserve to be won. Now, Arendt was echoing here an argument that John Maynard Keynes, the great economist, had made in 1930 in a once famous essay on the economic possibilities for our grandchildren. Keynes wrote, "To those who sweat for their daily bread, leisure is a longed for sweet until they get it. There is the traditional epitaph written for herself by the old charwoman." A charwoman is somebody who cleans other people's houses. "Don't mourn for me, friends. Don't weep for me, never, for I'm going to do nothing forever and ever. This was her idea of heaven. Thus, Keynes went on, for the first time since his creation, man will be faced with his permanent problem, how to use his freedom from pressing economic cares, how to occupy the leisure which science and compound interest will have won for him to live wisely and agreeably and well." Now, the general consensus since then has been essentially that Arendt and Keynes need not have worried. Our conception of what is valuable in human life has been so profoundly shaped by the place of work for people today that we suppose we will find new ways of making work, even if the biological needs that Arendt's labor was meant to meet can all be met by intelligent machines. But Keynes had anticipated a problem. For many years to come, he wrote, the old Adam will be so strong in us that everybody will need to do some work if he's to be contented. For the heirs to the Protestant ethic, heaven on earth, Keynes thought, would continue to be busy. George Bernard Shaw wrote, made the same claim more succinctly with reference not to heaven, but to hell. A perpetual holiday, he wrote, is a good working definition of hell. Now, the jobs created by the Industrial Revolution did at least four things. First, they produced goods in larger quantities with increasing efficiency. A second thing they did was to provide employees and shareholders with income. They built on the genius of capitalism for taking one person's savings and combining it with the industry of others and the ideas of yet others still to produce an income for all of them. A third important consequence was the creation of new forms of community. Trade unions came with union picnics, and factories have sports teams and Christmas parties. In the work itself, too, at least in the best of jobs, one's product is the result of rewarding social processes. It's the combined effect of the coordinated interaction of human beings collaborating, working together. And the final fourth contribution was that if you were lucky, your work was a source of significance. The working men's associations of 19th century Britain were reflections of a growing pride in manual labor. People came to appreciate that the goods they helped make were important in the country and to its people, and were often valued by others, not just at home, but around the world. Writing about 19th century trade unions, E.P. Thompson says in his classic book, The Making of the English Working Class, social and moral criteria, subsistence, self-respect, pride in certain standards of workmanship, customary rewards for different grades of skill, are as prominent in early trade union disputes as strictly economic arguments about money and hours. The English poet William Blake may have seen in the factories of the Industrial Revolution only what he famously called dark satanic mills. But the people in them increasingly saw the work they did as a source of pride, identity, and meaning. And the associations, unions, and clubs that they formed, in which people who worked together, played together, came to perform a role not just in their political lives, but in their social lives as well, at those picnics and parties. The Industrial Revolution begins in Britain in the mid-18th century. Over the next 2 centuries, working men and women increasingly needed more formal education to do their work. Following written instructions and keeping proper records presupposed literacy. And in the factories themselves, many jobs required calculations involving basic mathematical skills and arithmetic. People were trained to use more and more complex machines. As unions and their allies and legislatures pushed back the length of the working day and defended the weekend, and as wages increased, they had the sort of free time that had once been the privilege of their social superiors. Leisure was no longer a middle-class distinction, let alone the mark of an aristocracy. And over time, working people too came to seek the advantages of education for its own sake. The working classes were following here a path set earlier by the middle classes. Through the course of the 19th century, Romanticism encouraged an ideal of self-development, which we see in Matthew Arnold's condemnation of Philistinism in Culture and Anarchy, and in John Stuart Mill's celebration in the famous chapter 3 of his book on liberty, which is called On Individuality as one of the elements of well-being, of development. Playing and listening to music, reading literature, writing and reciting poetry, painting and sculpting and visiting art museums, learning history and social science, even following the natural sciences of their day, all came to be part of what was expected of an educated middle-class man or woman. And that's part of what Mill meant when he talked about human development. The Germans called this form of self-cultivation Bildung, and European societies had a growing class that they later called the Bildungsbürgertum, the educated bourgeoisie. One of the central questions for German thinkers beginning in the early 19th century was what they called the soziale Frage, the social question. At its heart was the welfare of the new working class created by industrialization, urbanization, and an expanding population. There are all these books on the social question. Eventually, Bildung came to be part of the story because Bildung was now a component of a normal human life. It wasn't just for the leisured aristocracy or for the free time of the prosperous middle class. It was for everybody. It was democratized. And so, starting at the turn of the 19th century, towards the end of it, in many places in Europe and North America, new institutions were created to extend the benefits of Bildung to workers. Beginning in the 1880s, the settlement house movement in Britain and the United States moved middle-class so-called settlers in alongside working class families, in part so that the former could share their culture with the latter. In 1899, Ruskin College was founded in Oxford to offer a college education to working men who did not have access to Oxford University. This democratization of learning began as one of the founding aims of the British Broadcasting Corporation in 1922 under the leadership of John Reith. Less than a century later, Lord Reith's ideals were reflected in the founding of the American Corporation for Public Broadcasting, whose stated purpose is to provide programs and services that inform, educate, enlighten, and enrich the public and help inform civil discourse, essential to American society. So one of the basic social and economic challenges of our time, I think, is to find ways of involving people in meaningful activity and at the same time, both distribute the social product fairly, giving everyone a satisfactory income, and also produce the goods and services we need. We need new ways of achieving those four important things that I said that good jobs did in industrial society. This is an intellectual and imaginative challenge as much as an institutional one. So it's going to involve all of us, artists, social scientists, philosophers, literary folk, humanists, and so on. I'm going to call it today's social question. It's our soziale Frage. That we can only solve it properly today if we do so in ways that are ecologically sustainable only adds to how difficult it is, this social question. This social question, then, is to work out how to produce the goods and services we need while providing people with income, sociability, and significance. And a major issue is whether we want to do this by changing the ways we construct and provide jobs, the root of what I'm going to call reimagining work, or by meeting these needs for many or most people without their having jobs, as a self-styled post-work movement has been suggesting. And the thought there is not just that work might disappear for many, but that the concept of work is an obstacle to progress. In deciding if it is, getting clear about how we understand work will surely be the right first step. Technological change means that fewer and fewer people are needed to produce the same quantities of goods and services. The result is that there are many people whose only income comes from the state and private philanthropy or from jobs that lack the satisfactions in income, meaning, and sociability that once secure the status of the prosperous industrial working class. If they've left the labor pool altogether and are no longer seeking employment, it's not just because they are literally no jobs. Rather, they have given up on finding a job for which they are qualified and that can be a source of self-respect, or if not of self-respect, at least of an income large enough to make up for the fact that the work is not a source of self-respect. Leaving the labor pool means, of course, that they no longer participate in the community of the workplace. They lose that form of sociability. But many of the new jobs don't have much scope for sociability either. With people now able to telecommute and to interact in the sort of way that we're doing right now, even those who do have employment may not gain the experience of community from their work. This lecture isn't going to do what a lecture normally does, which is to bring a group of people together in space who can then interact with each other before, during, and afterwards in a social experience, the social experience of the lecture. And it's also true about many jobs. If you work as an Uber or Lyft driver, or many other occupations in the gig economy, your assignments are organized without ever bringing you together with others who are doing the same job for the same company. So Uber drivers are not a community of workers. Worse, many modern people are doing what the anthropologist David Graeber, who sadly died recently, has dubbed, and I must now apologize to my late mother who will be watching from somewhere, but David Graeber called these bullshit jobs, defined as a job so completely pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee cannot justify its existence. Now, you might think there weren't many of those, but Graeber cites the result of a British YouGov poll that asked this question: does your job make a meaningful contribution to the world? And astonishingly, at least to me when I first read this, more than a third, 37% of people in Britain said that they believed that their job did not make a contribution to the world, a meaningful contribution to the world. 50% said it did, so that was good news, I suppose, but 13% didn't even know whether their job made a contribution to a meaningful contribution to the world. Now, Graeber claims, I think plausibly, that people often conflate these meaningless jobs, bullshit jobs, with something else, what he follows modern usage in calling, and again, I have to apologize to my late mother, shit jobs. The issues here are worth distinguishing, as he pointed out, because bullshit jobs and shit jobs are not the same thing. This is a definition from the Urban Dictionary, which keeps up with contemporary usage of what a shit job is, and you'll see. It's an unfulfilling, tedious waste of 8+ hours of the day, 5 days of the week that you only persist with in order to pay the bills, and the ever-mounting debt that comes from having to increase your spending in order to entertain yourself outside of working hours, as you are so brain dead from the hours you spend in work. All right, so that's a pretty good definition of a terrible job. But these two kinds of jobs, the bullshit jobs and the shit jobs, are not the same thing. Bad jobs are bad because they're hard, or they have terrible conditions, or the pay sucks. But often they're extremely useful. They do make a very meaningful contribution. So both kinds of jobs raise ethical problems, of course. Even if you recognize your job is useful, there's no guarantee that it will contribute to your satisfaction if the pay or working conditions are awful. Increasingly then, one source of meaning in human lives, the job, the career, and its sociability and its achievements, is going away. And though this problem has developed first in the industrialized democracies, it'll surely eventually spread everywhere. Now, it's certainly good, I think, that machines can be turned to doing and making useful things that it's no fun for people to make or to do. Where possible, what Graeber calls shit jobs need to be eliminated. It may also be good when the efficiency of production grows, in the sense that it takes fewer and fewer people to make something. Though we should give a moment's thought to the possibility that there are automatable tasks that human beings might enjoy doing and receiving the results of that we shouldn't automate. But our automated economy still makes the things that were at the core of production in the old economy. Indeed, we make more and better things. That, though, can leave income, sociability, and significance unattended to. You could solve that problem of the disappearance of the wage by establishing a basic income guaranteed to all citizens. But that, too, wouldn't help you with the loss of community and the loss of meaning. Conversely, in a society like ours, where no one can provide for their basic needs without money or expensive land, a life of sociability and meaning without access to an income is no longer possible. Now, there are three recognizably philosophical tasks here, I think. The first, which I've been pursuing all along, is what philosophers call conceptual analysis. I've been trying to explain, to make explicit our concept of work, how we think about work. Conceptual analysis of this sort is not, as sometimes was thought, a priori, something that you do without looking at the evidence, because work develops along with technologies and institutions. So the inquiry is in part historical because work and the concept of work develop together. Once we've understood what work is, which is a question in what philosophers would call social ontology, there is next an ethical inquiry. How does work fit into making a good life, advance what Aristotle called eudaimonia, human flourishing? Here too, the inquiry strikes me as also necessarily historical. But it also requires us to draw on our own social experience and on accounts in history, sociology, anthropology, and imaginative literature of the experiences of others. I don't mean that the conceptual and social inquiry are sharply bounded from the ethical inquiry. Our understanding of the meaning and the value of work develops historically with the economy, with the institutions and technologies we engage in our work. And the conceptual inquiry is already a normative inquiry, and it's not just about what is, but about what should be, because you can't understand what a job is without understanding the idea of a good job. The third set of issues is these set of socio-political issues. How should we constrain or construct work through law and other social norms? And how should opportunities and rewards for work be distributed? Now, we philosophers have models for thinking about these issues. One is the method of the philosopher John Rawls laid out in his theory of justice, in which we ask how we would respond to a question like how work should be organized if we didn't know what opportunities we ourselves would have. Behind what Rawls called the veil of ignorance, we think about questions, not knowing what position we would occupy. We ask, how would you organize a society? And we do so behind a veil of ignorance, because that way we can't fix things so that they happen to turn out well for us. But this question only arises for Rawls, the question of fairness, because society and the state are immense and valuable cooperative enterprises whose benefits and burdens must be fairly shared. The basic structure of society, the family, the law, the economy, the main political and social institutions and the way they fit together as one scheme of cooperation, as he once put it, must be, as he also put it, a fair system of social cooperation over time from one generation to the next? Now, I think much can be learned by asking these questions in the sort of Rawlsian way, but there's also a great deal to be learned from an approach I associate with that most philosophical of economists, Amartya Sen, who has rightly pointed out that you can judge a social option, A, say, better than social option B, without starting with a view of the best society and asking whether having A or having B brings you closer to it. Just as you can tell that a Rembrandt is better than any painting of mine without any idea of what the best painting would look like. You don't need to know what the heavens are like to know which way is up. This insight fits with another. Our collective moral learning doesn't require the development of a picture of an ideal society. It starts most often with the rejection of some current actual practice or structure which we come to see as wrong. You learn to be in favor of equality by noticing what is wrong with the unequal treatment of Black people or of women or working class people or lower caste people or LGBTQ people. You learn to be in favor of freedom by seeing what is wrong in the life of serfs or of the enslaved or of women in Purdah. So rather than invoking ideal societies, I'd rather ask whether we can move our actual norms, our laws and other institutions towards the provision for everyone of the resources for a more dignified human life. That is a question that arises from within a society that is up and running. You don't have to go behind the veil of ignorance. And the critique of current institutions and practices is developed because we discover through what John Stuart Mill called experiments of living, that features of our current life damage, on the one hand, or on the other hand, enhance the possibilities for human flourishing. We start, for example, with norms as they are, and we discover that they are disabling for trans people, and so they need revision. There's no need to think abstractly about the biological significance of sexual difference and imagine, without presuppositions, painting on an empty canvas what would be the best way of developing a set of ideas and practices around gender. What we need to do is to respond to the challenge to our current gender practices posed by the evident injustice to trans people of the way we have been going on. Because what makes a life of dignity can depend on local cultural understandings, the idea of a dignified life is not something that we can bring from outside social arrangements. It's not, that is, something we bring to our question, how to remake the world to enable a dignified life for everyone. We don't bring it to that question from the outside. We can only ask these questions about equality and dignity from within a society and from within its social understandings. Even when we ask about another society, as we might, we do so by bringing our understandings of equality and dignity and seeing whether, and if so how, they are expressed elsewhere. And both what is dignified and how to relate as equals are matters of ongoing ethical discovery. I'm very conscious myself, I'm in my mid-60s, of how much we've discovered over the past, of the course of my lifetime, about what was wrong with the ways in which women and LGBTQ people and trans people and so on were treated in the past. We've made a continuing process of ethical evolution. And in that historical development, there's a kind of dialectical relationship between changes in institutions and technologies on the one hand, and changes in the way we think, our normative understandings on the other. And that's evident in the changing conceptions of what it is for work to be rewarding and how work fits into the making of a human life. So, for example, the Luddites, who were convinced that the mechanization of existing forms of labor would destroy jobs, and so they destroyed machines. And they were right. The mechanization of existing forms of labor did destroy jobs, but it also created them. And the economist Ricardo Zago has taught me about the economic mechanism here in a variety of cases. So let's just take first the mechanization of agriculture, which has certainly reduced the number of agricultural workers in the United States. But it also lowered food prices and so increased demand for agricultural products, creating new jobs in the transportation and distribution and preparation of foods. As Zago pointed out to me, it's not a coincidence that the meatpacking district of New York and other cities hugely developed in the same periods in which mechanization of agriculture occurred. To take another example, the more recent spread of ATMs displaced bank tellers, but it increased the profits of the banks, allowing them to open more branches, as you may have noticed, where they hired more workers to do managerial tasks and customer care, jobs where people still have a comparative advantage over machines. So one current problem in the United States then is not so much a consequence of a net loss of jobs as of the human costs of the transition of one scheme or regime of jobs to another. The sorts of adjustments that occurred in the mechanization of agriculture and the spread of the ATM take time. And the literature in labor economics suggests that the recent round of job displacements as a result of automation and of the transfer of jobs to lower cost labor markets elsewhere has been accompanied by very slow improvements in employment. And by improvements, I mean the replacement of lost jobs with ones that are better. New jobs in an automating economy are usually going to require new skills. Finding or training workers with these skills can take time. A displaced worker's initial value in the new labor market may be lower than her value in the old one. It may take her time or money to acquire the necessary human capital. And one source of the growth of high school education in the early 20th century in the United States was the government's recognition that the children of the workers displaced from pre-mechanical agriculture needed preparation for new forms of employment in the city. And finally, the new jobs may be in new places, and someone has to bear the costs of internal migration, of workers moving to where the jobs are. These traditional difficulties seem to be accentuated in the current economy by four things. First, progress in information technology and robotics has contributed to increasing polarization in the labor market. IT displaces many middle-class jobs, like those in the car industry, that require moderate levels of training and skill. And the new jobs are either high-skill, high-wage, or low-skill, low-wage jobs, contributing to the hollowing out of the middle class that we often talk about today. Second, in the United States at least, the share of GDP going to workers appears to have been steadily declining. I'm aware that there are disputes among economists about the facts here, so I'm just announcing a view that I derive from my friends in labor economics, not defending it. Third, the increasing concentration of so-called superstar firms like Amazon, Google, and so on, means that they can erect barriers to entry that reduce competition in ways that limit the bargaining power both of workers and of customers. And fourth, one factor in the creation of the modern precariat, the class of people who are only precariously in the labor economy, have low income, unstable access to jobs, and so on. One factor in the creation of that class is the fact that people within North America, and even in smaller geographies such as that of the United Kingdom, are less likely than you might have expected to go where the jobs are. And one cause of that is the increasing disparity between the costs of living in rural areas and small towns on the one hand, and the most productive metropolises on the other, just as another reason is the polarization of values between the small town and the cosmopolitan city. People who like small town life don't want to live in the cosmopolitan city, and of course, the same is true the other way around. We face now a set of normative questions about whose job it is to meet these challenges. Is it the job of the government, corporations, schools and universities, and private philanthropy? Well, all of them are playing a role, but what's the proper division of responsibilities? Some policies that have been considered to meet these difficulties aim, in effect, to strengthen the position of workers in their negotiations of these issues in one of four ways. First, by increasing their skills through education and training. Second, by assisting them in identifying new opportunities. Third, through a commitment by the government to be an employer of last resort, guaranteeing every person a meaningful job consistent with their developed capacities. And fourth, by guaranteeing a basic income, which I mentioned before, which allows people to refuse jobs that are not sufficiently rewarding in income, esteem, sociability, or significance, to tempt them away from a life, a secure life without work. Now, the first three of these possibilities treat the problem as a matter of reforming the nature of work. Here, business and the educational system and the state all have a role to play. But the fourth option, entertains the possibility, sketched by Keynes, as I mentioned at the start, of sharing the social product in ways that move beyond the idea of work as the temporal and meaning semantic center of our lives. So that's the post-work option. And one possible such option, as I say, is to guarantee everyone a basic income. That would require, of course, a political decision, and that requires all of us to engage in reflection on our values and how we wish to make human life successful in the world of new technologies. Denis Celentano, the philosopher I mentioned, taught me to see that there may be moral reasons for wondering whether people might not have a duty to work if they can. This isn't just a matter of adhering to the secularized version of the Protestant ethic that pervades many modern societies. The most natural understanding of the feature of work that is relevant here is that if the work isn't a bullshit job, it entails spending time doing something that makes a social contribution. And once we think of the basic structure of society as a scheme of cooperation, whose obligations and rewards need to be fairly distributed, then someone who's not making a contribution to the scheme is no more entitled to its privileges than someone in a society elsewhere. It doesn't follow that we owe her nothing any more than the fact that someone lives in another country means we can ignore her in our moral thinking. But there seems to be a basis here for the thought that it's only through work that we are connected to others in society in the ways that raise the question of fairness of distribution of the social product at all. Now, this is an interesting argument, but I think there are immediate reasons for resisting it, resisting the idea that there's a duty to engage in paid work. My answer is to this question is no. For a couple of reasons. One is that the basic structure includes more than the economy. So the family is a site where many of the things we do, especially in the domain of child rearing, have not, at least in the past, counted as work. And so is our political life as participants, as voters, and so on. And through our obedience to the law, all of these are things that through which we make a contribution in ways in which we haven't historically been rewarded through income. And in politics, as in the family, there have been rewards for these things in the past because we get esteem, we get respect for our contributions into the family and in political life, but we don't get an income. It's actually quite hard to imagine a modern person whose life is totally without contributions in one or other of these domains away from what we think of as work. But even if someone succeeded in escaping from contributing, there would be other reasons for wondering whether a duty to work imposed as a condition of any social provision would be consistent with others of our values. It seems evident, for example, that all of us do have obligations to others, most obviously duties not to harm them, that do not depend on the fact of our being connected in a scheme of cooperation. The fact that I mustn't harm you, I mustn't hit you over the head, isn't a consequence of the fact that we are connected in a scheme of cooperation. It's a much more basic moral demand than that. Furthermore, at least some ways of making social provision depend on contributions, can violate ethical notions of autonomy. The philosopher Beate Rössler has written, if subjects have to work, whether they want to or not, then with regard to the very question of why people work, their autonomy doesn't seem to play a role. Her point is that if you force people to work, even if you give them a range of options, they don't have the option of not working, and that interferes with their autonomy. So she's asking us to consider whether imposing work as a condition of providing someone with the means for a dignified existence might violate their right to autonomy. Now, I think autonomy requires, and here I follow the philosopher Joseph Raz, only, as he put it, an adequate range of valuable options and independence from coercion and manipulation. So why should having to do some kind of work or other, picked from a wide range of meaningful occupations for which you are prepared, mean that you don't have adequate options or you don't have freedom from manipulation? To say that someone is forced in these circumstances to work, or coerced or exploited, is to beg the question, because to be coerced is to be pressured in morally impermissible ways to do something. And to be exploited is to have someone wrongfully take advantage of your vulnerability. A person who has the option of many decent jobs, even if she'd rather stay home, is not vulnerable to any particular employer, nor, given a range of reasonable choices, is it evidently wrong to expect her to take up one of them. So, to put it simply, it's not obvious that to have an adequate range of choices, you must have the option of relying on the contributions of others for your basic needs. There are reasons, too, for wondering about the social and psychological challenges of a world in which many fewer people were gaining their incomes from something like work. The sociological literature on employment raises many doubts about the possibility of a satisfying life without it. On the other hand, evidence drawn from the experience of unemployment or of retirement in our current social system seems like a bad place to start. Because, as the sociologist Daniel Sage has argued recently, unemployed people live in societies where paid work yields status, identity, respect, and human worth. The damage of unemployment is thus not the absence of paid work, but the failure to conform to a powerful social norm. In a culture where, as the political scientist James Chamberlain has argued, work is seen as an expression of virtue and good character, good work anyway, hard work, an expression of virtue and good character, and symbolizes independence and is the main way to fulfill civic duty and make a social contribution, it's not surprising if not having work produces depression or anxiety. But we need to entertain the possibility that those responses, that depression, that anxiety, are the result of a philosophical error, not a constraint on possible new forms of social life with new social norms. Maybe if we develop the right ways of understanding what it is to be a responsible person, and that doesn't involve huge amounts of your time spent at something called work, people will stop feeling that there's something wrong with them if they aren't doing it, because so many people will not be doing it. We don't know about these things if we look only at societies where people are expected to do work, and where, if they do experience unemployment or retirement, they do so against the background of the assumption that work is the norm. So the issues I've been discussing will arise in a post-work society, whether it's just a less work society, a shorter, smaller amount of time spent at work, in which we do paid work for fewer hours, or if we settle on providing a universal basic income, and many people engage in no paid work at all. Of course, people on a universal basic income aren't going to do nothing. They're going to make things, for example, but they won't be being paid for making them. Or if they are being paid for making them, that'll be kind of supplementary to meeting their basic needs. And these issues will arise even if we share rewarding labor, deciding that there isn't enough of it to go around, but thinking that, as in many things, when there isn't enough to go around, we should share. Or where we, on the other hand, share the unrewarding, unpleasant, socially necessary tasks that we can't automate, because it's not fair that they should be given to just some people. Now, work, in other words, will need to be reconfigured in any case if we take seriously the idea of lives in which income is no longer dependent on a job. And as I say, at the heart of these reflections is the recognition that just as the Industrial Revolution, which I mentioned at the start, produced new conceptions of value, and the idea, for example, of the equation of time with money, which is sort of new at that point, so in our modern economy, changing institutions will have to be accompanied by conceptual and institutional innovations that it will take the imagination of all of us in every field to shape and to share. Thank you, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Appiah, for a fascinating lecture. This is a moment for questions and answers. As you can see, the question and answer slide is up. Now is your chance to enter questions in the Q&A section of your window. I will relay a number of them to Professor Appiah to reflect on and answer. Are you ready to receive some questions, Professor Appiah?
Absolutely, yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So the first question I have is, doesn't guaranteeing a basic income in fact encourage refusal of jobs? After all, a paid vacation sounds very appealing. Also, the rest of us then would have to support the job refuser. What are your thoughts on that?
So that's the issue I was raising of how we should think about whether someone who is not doing a paid job is a contributing member of society. And it may well be that people will resent those who don't do that. But let's just think about what happens when what might happen when people do have a guaranteed basic income. Because income is only one of the things that I mentioned in relation to jobs, and I also mentioned sociability and meaning, people on basic incomes are going to have to, they're going to have to fill their time. And being humans, being, as Aristotle said, we are a zoon politikon, we're a creature of the polis, an animal of the city, an animal of social life. They're going to want to be doing something. So the idea that I think that people will prefer a permanent vacation to opportunities to engage with others in meaningful ways, I don't think that's very likely. That's why, as I mentioned at the start, you might think that a permanent vacation was a good working definition of hell. Most of us need interaction. We gain a sense of meaning in our lives from interactions with other people and from things that are, from an economic point of view, producing goods and making services. Lots of people, it may be that lots of people on basic incomes, for example, will choose to make paintings. Those paintings will soon clutter up their houses, and they'll be interested in other people having those paintings. And at that point, they'll either exchange them or they'll increase their income by putting them out into the world. But in either case, they'll be doing something valuable to make a human life. I think life as a painter, especially for a good one, is clearly a valuable form of human life. And so they'll be doing these things that are worth doing. Since the basic income is not coming, as it were, directly from those who are continuing to work, because remember, a large part of, I mean, I didn't mention this, but a significant part of the argument for basic income is just that there's a huge amount of socially produced wealth around that isn't being produced by anybody now. It's a social inheritance. We inherited the highway system. Nobody living today made the highway system. We inherited the museums and the art galleries and so on. They're being maintained now, but the people maintaining them wouldn't have anything to do if dead people hadn't been doing things for centuries to make these things possible. Universities are full of capital, things where capital means stuff that's the result of the earlier labor of other people. And that doesn't belong, that isn't made by anybody now. It doesn't belong to anybody now, and we can share it because it's equally all of us. There are reasons, which this is another topic I didn't talk about, but there are reasons for thinking about how much we should allow people to transfer wealth to the next generation by giving it to people that they choose. We may need a system of differential incomes in order to incentivize people to do things worth doing. And so we need to reward people. But it's not clear that we need to reward their children or their grandchildren. And so it's a reasonable question whether we shouldn't have significant taxation on intergenerational transfers of wealth. And if that happens, that'll be another source of money that doesn't belong to anybody in particular that can be used. So the idea that the people who are working should think that they are, that it's their money that's going to the people who are not working, that's not right. That won't be true. So if it turns out, of course, if it turns out that if we set the basic income at a certain level, lots of things that we need doing won't get done, then we are going to have to pay more for the jobs that need doing above the basic income or lower the basic income. Those are the options. But I think it's extremely unlikely, given the significance that people derive from the work. I don't do my job. I'm extremely well paid. Thank you very much, NYU. But I don't do my job for the money. And And though I don't want the dean to hear this, I mean, the dean of the college, not Dean Jarrett, as long as I could live, I'd probably go on doing what I do right now with zero income, because of the satisfaction of spending time with young people and with colleagues, thinking about the things I think about and transmitting to the next generation the valuable things that I think humanists have to transmit to the next generation. And lots of people are doing things like that. Doing interesting areas of law is really interesting. It's not a meaningless job. If you're a successful lawyer, it's extremely rewarding. I grew up in the household of a successful lawyer. My father was president of the Bar Association, and he had his office in the house, so I know what it's like to be a successful lawyer. It's very interesting. So there are lots of things that people do for reasons other than money.
Very good. Thank you. We have plenty of questions coming in. How about this one? When we work from home, as in the pandemic, how does the conflating of workplace and home place influence how we think of work and home? Do we think what we are working, how we're working more or less, and how does that impact our reimagining of work vis-a-vis as being separate from home?
This is a great question. And I think that the pandemic, with this enforced acceleration of a process, which had already happened to some extent for some jobs, of saying to people, look, we have technology that means we don't have to have you in the office. And the office commuting is expensive. It's also a burden on the ecology. Commuting increases the carbon load of every job that involves commuting. And also, the employer doesn't have to pay for the office space, and so it saves money for the corporation. So there are people who've been pushing in that direction anyway. Now, all of us who are lucky enough to have jobs that can be continued in this way have been experiencing this and learning that, I hope people have been learning what I think is obviously true, which is that the sociability of most of our jobs is an enormously important part of them. And that one thing we've learned is that while we can take some jobs home in this way, even full time, we may not want to. And that one of the things that people enjoy is the separation of their paid life from their life at home. So these are all things that we're going to have to think about, and we have been equipped by the pandemic with a new range of experiences with which to think about them. I think it's a really useful, I mean, horrible pandemic, wish it hadn't happened, but just sort of making, as it were, lemon juice out of lemons, even though lemons are sour. I think we should be reflecting on what it is and what we do and what we don't need to be doing away from home. One of the really big losses of this period is the socialization of children in school that they get from spending time many hours a day, every day, with other children. Spending time, and that is very importantly playtime, not just class time. It's interactions in the classroom that aren't teacher directed, and so on. And all of that is one of the big losses. And we will see a big cognitive deficit, I'm afraid, because around the world we'll see this, because this has happened in many places. We'll see a big cognitive deficit because children will have been delayed in their intellectual, cognitive, emotional development by the lack of access to these things. And for those of you who believe in homeschooling, I am not saying that people who are homeschooled don't emotionally and cognitively develop, but people who are seriously homeschooling their children think about how to socialize them because they don't have the automatic socialization of the school. So this is a really important lesson, I think. We'll see. We'll be able to measure this, unfortunately, the costs in terms of development. So, I don't pretend to have the answers to these questions. My job is to, I think, is to get people to say, look, recognize that these are jobs. These are questions worth thinking about. I myself have found aspects of one thing that's extremely valuable to me with my international interests is that these technologies allow me to talk to colleagues whose visiting home would be extremely expensive and exhausting. I've been talking to colleagues in many countries and many continents over the last year through this technology, learning from them, and talking to students. Of course, many of my students last semester and some this semester are, you know, in India and China and Australia and around the world. And I value the fact that this technology makes it possible for me to continue my relationships with them as teacher and student, which would be impossible otherwise. So this I'm not against the technology. The technology has obviously made enormous possibilities that we would have been very sad to see go. But I'm also clear that I would like to be able, when I used to teach a course in Abu Dhabi with a colleague in Abu Dhabi, and I was here and he was there, and then once or twice a semester we would swap, and I would go there and and he would come here. And the point of that was that these were seminars, and the point of that was that having the coffee in an actual coffee shop with the student is different from however many hours you spend on Zoom, and being able to have a meal together and all those things. So so there are things that, you know, we're going to love coming back to. But there are other things, as I say. I mean, I can have a meeting. I did yesterday go to a meeting at Harvard about a philosopher I'm interested in, which was attended by people in Switzerland and West Africa and Germany. And we had a good seminar. That's good. And we should go on doing that. We should go on using the good sides of this. Other jobs, other things happen. My husband is an editor at the New Yorker magazine, and he misses the conversations in the corridor that help shape the magazine, because they're sort of thinking 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks ahead. What should the shape of the magazine? And the easiest way to do that is just to knock on somebody's door and say, "I've been thinking about this thing." So they've actually organized sessions with each other, not all together, but in little groups, where they just shoot the breeze, as it were, together, in order to replicate something that happens automatically if you have an office. So they're missing that, and they want to get back to it.
Great. We'll just take one or two more questions. They're flowing in right now. Let's look at this one. First of all, the person says, "Thank you for this substantive and thought-provoking lecture." And so congratulations. I think a lot of people are appreciating your lecture. What do you see as the role of an institution like NYU, and specifically the role of faculty in helping students understand and establish their relationship to work? Not just granting them a credential to enter a certain spheres of the labor force, but conceptualizing and approaching their work in ways that are good for them, for society, and so forth.
Well, if we're any good at our jobs, we are doing that. I mean, one of the great things about the central model of four-year education for undergraduates in the United States is that it is a model that aims to give people a liberal education. And a liberal education, the liber in liberal comes not from book, but from freedom. A liber is a free man. So it's the liber in liberty, not the liber in library. And free people need lots of intellectual and emotional tools to lead a decent life. And one of the things that college is doing is giving you more of those than you get if you complete your formal education at the end of high school. So we insist that whatever you're doing, and even if you're in the business school or the engineering school, we insist, where you think you already know you want to be an engineer or you want to be a certain kind of business person, we insist that you have a broader education that prepares you for lots of things. So this sort of thing, the world is changing. Those solid middle-class jobs that I mentioned in the 1950s and 60s, you could get one, rise slowly in income through your life, retire with a pension, and never have to think about a job search after the age of 20. There are not many possibilities like that anymore. So you've got to be thinking in planning your life, just in planning your own life, never mind in thinking about society, about the possibilities of other things than the thing that you start out doing first of all. And to do that, you have to have the kind of understanding of society that economics and sociology and philosophy and anthropology and history give you. and literary studies, the imaginative access to possibilities that you get from fiction and poetry. So that's why we make sure that everybody does a bit of all of those things if we can, because we think that it's helpful in, now all these skills are going to be useful at work as well, so that's fine, but they're also useful in your own life making and in another place, which is you are a citizen and you have responsibilities as a citizen to participate in the most important thing citizens do qua citizens, which is to manage the society together. And we can't do that. We can't make sensible decisions about which politicians to support, which programs to support, unless we have some sense of what the challenges are that face our society. Now, I think one of the great benefits of a decent society is that you don't have to think about politics all the time. I have to say that for the last 4 years, I've been thinking about politics too much, and I regret that. But all of us as citizens need to think about politics some of the time, even though we don't all need to be experts on political matters. And again, to do that, you need all kinds of tools. I haven't mentioned the natural sciences, but of course, the natural sciences are important in both of these ways too. They're important because having a grip on the sorts of things that are being talked about when you read about articles on the development of the virus vaccines, or on new work on what's going on the planets, in the new work that NASA is doing. You need to have some familiarity with the language of the sciences, and also to have some, ideally, you have some sense of how science is done. You've spent some time in a lab, you have a feel for science, some kind of science. So that's intrinsically valuable. Understanding the best science of your day is useful, but it's also intrinsically valuable. What could be more worthwhile than having access to the best understanding of our world that the best thinkers have come up with as a community? So there again, it's useful in instrumental ways in our civic life. It's rewarding in our personal lives, and it's helpful in thinking about our civic lives. So that doesn't mean we have to spend all our time lecturing you about these things, because you'll be picking up this knowledge that will be useful in all these ways without our pointing out that you're picking up knowledge that's useful in these ways. We don't have to tell you that all the time. Most of you are smart enough to figure that out for yourselves. But it is part of certainly what I think I'm doing. And I'll say one last thing about that, which is because of the way I think about human flourishing, I think that it's really important that what I'm doing is giving people tools to make up their own mind about things. It's not my job to tell you how to live or what the best way to live is. It's not my job to tell you what the solution is to anything. I mean, I'll propose solutions as a citizen, and I'll be interested to hear what people think of them. But it's not my job my job is to give you the tools so that you can participate in those decisions and in those conversations. So I don't want people to come out of my classes agreeing with me. And in fact, often I hope they come out of my classes not knowing what I think about certain things, because my object isn't to get them to think anything in particular. It's to give them the tools so that they can think something for themselves.
Thank you, Professor Appiah. We have concluded our Q&A session. I'd like to thank you for your time, insight, and generosity in delivering your lecture, and also in having such a thoughtful Q&A session. I'm certain that many of our viewers learned so much from you. Once again, I want to thank all of our viewers for attending this CAS Bentson lecture. Stay well and safe, and see you next time. On behalf of the College of Arts and Science at New York University, I wish you the best. Take care, and bye-bye.
Thanks for those great questions.
Thank you.